Welcome everyone to the last round of the Pillar. Thank you for being here and for your stamina and patience. I think it's been a terrific day. Everyone's been so good so far. And I stole that. That's a Roy Fisher joke. Stolen that one. That's why it's good. What we're going to do, I'm going to do the same sort of idea as we've been doing all day. I'm going to introduce the readers, and then I'm going to sit down, and they will come up and do their thing one after another. We thought that we would read, everyone's going to read a poem by Prince, and perhaps a poem of their own. And I thought we would read in the order of the poems by Prince appear in his collected work. So that turns out to be John Hall is going to read from Epistle to a Patron. Todd Swift is going to read a poem that he's already mentioned a little bit, To a Man on His Horse. Tom Rayworth is going to read the poem that was discussed in passing today, At a Parade, from the first collection and then never reprinted. John Haynes, Tim Julie is going to read the book from Doors of Stone. John Haynes is going to read the last four of the Strambotti. Lee Howard is going to read Sea View. Anthony Howell is going to read from His Dog and Pilgrim. And then I'll read a little bit from Walks in Rome, which goes back to the Caravaggio poem. I wonder if I can just assume we all know each other, rather than to go through the bibliographies and so on. So that's what I will do. But before I sit down, as I mentioned in passing, we emailed John Ashbury to see if he could, there's my mention, to see if he could come. He's years old now, as you know, and he couldn't come. But I asked him if he'd like to say something. And I suggested, video link, conference call, Skype, all that kind of thing. But instead he wrote something. And here's what he wrote, and then he suggested a couple of poems that might be read. I'm not going to even pretend to do the voice. I discovered Prince's poetry when I was about 16 in the excellent collection of the Public Library in Rochester, NY, near where I grew up. I believe my first encounter with was with his pamphlet In New Directions Poet of the Month series, which came out for a few years in the early 1940s. Later I made my first trip to New York City at the age of 17 and immediately headed for the famous bookstore, the Gotham Book Mart, owned by the eccentric and somewhat despotic Francis Steploff, where I found a copy of the 1938 poems. At least that's my recollection. What struck me first about Prince was how modern he sounded, and yet how traditional compared to his contemporaries Auden, Spender, McNeice, Nicholas Moore, etc. That's still what intrigues me about him today. My favourite poem of his, if I have to choose one, is The Moonflower, with its magical first line, The secret drops of love run through my mind. This line, and indeed the whole poem, sounds more Victorian than Swinburne or Clough, yet at the same time more revolutionary than the Auden generation, which may be why they seemed never to fully acknowledge him as a contemporary. I think he suffered from this as well he might have. The situation he described in the last stanza, all being like the moonflower is dissatisfied for the dark kiss that the night only gives, seems to depict a strikingly modern situation, especially dissatisfied for the dark kiss. One would expect the kiss to bring satisfaction, but that's not quite what Prince is saying. He is saying that night gives only to the soul that waits in longing, and in that only lives. What is that, night or longing? Both, obviously, are essential to the soul's life. I should add that I was fortunate enough to meet Prince on my first trip to London in 1956 through a mutual friend, the American film critic Richard Roud. Prince and his wife Elizabeth invited me to tea at Brown's Hotel, obviously knowing what would please a young American Anglophile. We met a number of times after that, including at a reading he gave in New York at the Church of the Transfiguration, known locally as the Little Church Around the Corner, for folkloric reasons I won't go into here. And again at a reading arranged by Anthony Howell at a pub in Cardiff. I remember him fondly as extremely kind, never fully at ease and somewhat wistful about his ambiguous position in 20th century poetry. I don't feel justified in calling one of my poems similar to his, but there might be a distant resemblance in my early poem, Some Trees, written just a few years after I discovered Frank's poetry. So here's the Moonflower, and then Some Trees. Where's the Moonflower? Sorry, under-organized. Yeah, got it. The Moonflower. The secret drops of love run through my mind. Midnight is filled with sounds of the full sea that has risen softly among the rocks. Air stirs the cedar tree. Somewhere a fainting sweetness is distilled. It is the moonflower hanging in its tent of twisted broad-leaved branches by the stony path that squanders the cool scent. Pallid, long as a lily, it swings a little as if drunk with its perfume and the night, which draws its perfume out and leaves the flower the weaker for its flight. Detached from my desire, in my oblivion of this world that surrounds me, in weariness of all but darkness, silence, starry solitude, I too feel that caress. Delicate, serene and peaceful, lonely, strange to the intellect and the imagination, the touch with which reality wounds and ravishes our inmost desolation. All being like the moonflower is dissatisfied for the dark kiss that the night only gives, and night gives only to the soul that waits in longing, and in that only lives. And here, open at it. Some trees. These are amazing, each joining a neighbour as though speech were a still performance, arranged by chance to meet as far this morning from the world as agreeing with it, you and I are suddenly what the trees try to tell us we are, that their merely being there means something, that soon we may touch, love, explain. And glad not to have invented such comeliness, we are surrounded, a silence already filled with noises, a canvas on which emerges a chorus of smiles, a winter morning, placed in a puzzling light and moving, our days put on such reticence, these accents seem their own defence. John.
Thanks very much. Peter, is it still an idea that we do a little thing of our own, or are we running out of time?
If you like, I think it's okay. Yes, please
Yeah,
do.
that was our
That's the plan.
presentation.
Go with the plan.
Go with the plan. Yes, I like to go with plans. Place of plans, obviously. And I'm really glad that we had the moonflower, because I was torn between this and that of the moonflower, so I'm very glad to have heard that. I'm going to read the opening of a poem that's been mentioned so many times today, an epistle to a patron, and I'm going to read it until the first full stop at the end of a line. Okay. I'm thinking of some of the things that cropped up earlier. It's quite a long time, by the way. An epistle to a patron. My lord, hearing lately of your opulence in promises and your house busy with parasites, of your hands full of favours, your statutes admirable as music, and no fear of your arms not prospering, I have considered how to serve you, and breed from my talents these few secrets which I shall make plain to your intelligent glory. You should understand that I have plotted, being in command of all the ordinary engines of defence and offence, 115 buildings, less others less complete. Complete, some are courts of serene stone, some the civil structures of a warlike elegance as bridges, sewers, aqueducts and citadels of brick, with which I declare the fact that your nature is to vanquish. For these I have acquired a knowledge of the habits of numbers and of various tempers, and skill in setting firm sets of pure bare members, which will rise, hanging together, like an argument, with beams, ties, and sistering pilasters. The lintels and windows with mouldings as round as a girl's chin, thresholds to libraries, halls that cannot be entered without a sensation as of myrrh by your vermilion officers, your sages and dancers. There will be chambers like the recovery of a sick man, your closet waiting not less suitably shadowed than the heart, and the coffers of a ceiling to reflect your diplomatic taciturnities. You may commission hospitals, huge granaries that will smile to bear your filial plunders, and stables washed with a silver line, in whose middle tower, seated in the slight acridity, you may watch the copper thunder kept in the sulky flanks of your horse, a rolling field of necks glad to be groomed, the strong crupper, the edged hoof, and the long back, seductive and rebellious to saddles. I'm cheating. That was a footfall. And barracks, fortresses, in need of no vest save light that to me is breath, food, and drink. I live by effects of light. I live to catch it, to break it, as an orator plays off against each other and his theme, his casual gems. And so with light, twisted in strings, plucked, crossed or knotted or crumbled, as it may be allowed to be by leaves, or clanged back by lakes and rocks, or otherwise beaten, or else spilt and spread like a feast of honey, dripping through delightful voids and creeping along long fractures, brimming carved canals, bowls and lacrimatories with pearls, all this the work of no advancing, no withdrawing faces, whose use I know. I spent a year in this institution in 1969-70, when I had the pleasure of meeting and talking and being lunched by. Somebody mentioned lunch as such as a distant memory. I tell you what, it was an excellent lunch and the conversation was wonderful. Frank was my host. And this poem was written, which way am I pointing? The common? This is the common. And it was, let me pretend that it was after a conversation with Frank Prince. It's called Support Rhodesia. Do you remember that? Support Rhodesia. This is highly selective. He's on the common, walking his dog. The sun hurts his eyes. His attitudes are at perfect ease. It's the weekend. An oratorical fervour in the leaves appeases a notion of urgency that has been mounting recently. Isn't nature wonderful, he says? Doesn't she leave one with such a sense of perspective on the issues that disturb our days? Look at the ducks. The squirrels leap to the requirements of our present thoughts of them. The trees stand rooted for the duration of the point we're making. Oh man, it all makes you feel so good.
Hello everyone, it's lovely to be here. What an extraordinarily moving day this has been. I hate to say like John Ashbery, but like John Ashbery, I discovered F.D. Prince when I was about 16 or 17. And he was so very important to me as a young poet up until this very day. Not that I'm a young poet anymore, but you get what I'm saying. As speaking to Peter Robinson once about this, he said he gave us permission. And he gave me permission to enjoy poetry in a way that I wasn't getting from other poets. So to see so many people here today and talk so movingly and intelligently about him has been just wonderful for me. So the poem of his I'd like to read is To a Man on His Horse, which I mentioned earlier in my talk, and which I might have even read in my talk, but anyway, it's lovely to share it with you again now. Only the Arab stallion will I envy you. Along the water you dance him with the morning on his flanks. In the frosty morning that his motions flatter, he kindles, and where the winter's in the wood, I watch you dance him out on delicate shanks. And lashes fall on a dark eye. He sheds a silvery mane, he shapes his thin nostrils like a fop's. And to do honor to his whiteness and remembrance of his ancient blood, I have wished to become his groom, and so his smoldering body comb in a simple and indecorous sweetness. And there again we hear the word sweetness, which was mentioned earlier in a fantastic talk, became a kind of a leitmotif. I never realized that before, but it's in so many of his poems. Now, I'm going to read one poem from my most recent collection, When All My Disappointments Came at Once, and it's partially formed on the creative portion of my PhD, which I did at UEA. I was supervised by Denise Riley, and early on in the process of my working on my poetry, she said to me, do you know that you write so much like F.T. Prince at times? You really should make something of that. You know, you should actually intentionally set out to write a book that explores that as much as possible. So there were a number of poems that I could choose today to share with you that showcased his impact on my work. And in fact, speaking to one of his granddaughters just now, she was talking about how he converted to Catholicism later on in life and how she thought that was perhaps a little bit of a strange decision. Well, I actually converted to Catholicism quite recently, and I think that one of the reasons was because of F.T. Prince. So strong is his influence on me. But the other thing, just to set up this poem very quickly, it's not as long as the introduction is going to be, is that when I was a young man, of about 17, I spent the summer, or 18, I spent the summer in Italy. And at that time, and interestingly enough, just to say, compared to Prince, I'm married and I'm Catholic, but when I was 17, I was madly in love with a young man named Douglas. And we didn't do very much together, except kiss and hold hands, but we were very much in love. And this is a poem called In Memory of F.T. Prince, which is really a poem that is my version of Soldiers Bathing. And I saw in the archives that Ronald Bottrell had written a kind of a similar thing. So there might be a genre of erotic poems or poems about people who have been inspired by that poem. We went swimming together in Italy. I open with the following quote. And this is from an early published version of Soldiers Bathing that was signed F.T. Prince, Captain, MEF, British. And the quote is, because to love is terrible, we prefer the freedom of our crimes. And this is about burying earlier urges. And it's in only 2 sentences. And the first sentence ends more deeply in blood lies, and then it goes on. Desire ages hardly at all, edges like those of a book, curled at the beach, where waves, sent by the summer, brush the salt away, finely combed. And it is homosexual love that holds us in its palm, that cuts and dries the hair we both wore like uniforms, that day that was a decade, though neither of us found a bed that could be so cleanly made. For now, married on continents split, as if in some biblical debate, we have shelved those dreamy acts of early indiscipline, where, cock from trousers, cock in hand, we edged together to a cliff, a Christian form of final decision in the Italian sand, but stepped away from intercourse or love, decided that as men, our hearts belonged to those who could tend it otherwise, and so packed up our bathing suits and wore trim expressions home at dawn, dressed like wounds more deeply in blood lies. Words have a purpose, if no meaning, beyond shorelines where they crash, which is to deface emotion with communication in a style that drowns the jungle wholesale, and no arc or personality can swim free of its deciding glamour and deceptive fluidity. So smile and say, it was not love that drove our Damascene caresses to a cross upon which loss lay openly, but desire suffered in its private language. No, it was decorum or fear of impropriety, simply petty feeling, feeling inadequate to emotionality. But those who nailed the arm of God into the wood were strong enough to withstand hardier cruelty and played at the weeping feet, just as the artists, unknown mostly except for the names of school or master too, commanded passion to an ordering pictorial and strange, of such derangements of the body as we could never have drawn from our quivers to disarrow. True, so saying even being overcome is not the terrible action it appears. No, it is the naive aversion to it, slowly accruing to regret by year, that marks the one who, like Cain, enters a town each time as someone immediately despised, narrow-paned, leaving the districts with stones, for signs the boys follow out with on the path. Love's release is betraying, even as it holds back confession to end as marble, a certain epitaph. Thank you very much.
It's been an interesting day. Thank you all. Congratulations to Peter and Will for making it all possible. I'm particularly touched that Peter Robinson has lent me the book in which the poem I'm going to read appeared for the first time in the year of my birth. I'm glad that Frank is back. I never thought he'd gone anywhere. At a parade, we watch the only eagles in the world, how under the crimson flags they have unfurled, they ruffle in furs and plumes, a rod bear or a brazen bonnet nod, and at their side, under embroidered sashes, long swords, ride horses dancing under arms and bosom friends to their alarms, till will those bugles blowing, the space before the wetly glowing, low-lying palace, filled up with that crowd, your heart and my heart seem to cry aloud. And standing together and watching, you and I have thrown our hearts like caps into the sky. For as I serve you, so I find I would be another of that kind, and martial eyes, luxurious lucid mind, and eyes to celebrate the moving world. And though a madness is unfurled, though rage and greed would be at blows, and Europe's noisier than a bawdy house, what else can I be good for but to praise and to defend the world, even in these days? And the soldier is also only a kind of tool, and maybe dissolute, foul-mouthed, or a fool, yet by that animal expense, bodily brilliance, insolence, it seems that he may gain peculiar humility. Therefore too we must be bold, and say these gild the field they hold, though serving anything commended by a criminal century or king, they cover their breasts and shoulders with bright rills of glory, it lies in pools about the horse's heels. Each is the incorruptible masculine, and each remains, though dipped in blood and sin, the lion coloured like a lady, and riding out at dawn is ready and understands why all rewards are wrung out of his hands, why he dies and knows alone the order of what was to be done. I therefore seize those manners, and moving with that music under banners, I have preserved the pieties that were used, and all the gilded tissues lost, unloosed. So I thought it should be 4-to-1 ratio. Western world. Horse's breath missed the hitching rail. Fire reflects in both eyes. Cold night along cement walls. Everywhere men are doing their duty. Guarding prisoners from fires, horses, children and space. While insects coldly breed, one of them crawls from eye to eye. Eggs hatch in all four corners of the motionless eyes. The eyes of those tiny insects reflect 1,000 times the horse's breath.
I was very grateful to Natalie Pollard for her talk this afternoon, because she talked among other, she talked about the book in general, but also extensively about a poem called The Book. And for me, Prince has to do with the book and was my own experience of the book. I first came across the name F.D. Prince in a book by Lee Harwood, The White Room, which was lent to me as a teenager by Chris Torrance, who's somebody who lived near me in Bristol. And there's a poem there which you describe yourself as a silly poem, but wasn't. But it also mentions both F.D. Prince and Edward Denby. It took me a long time to find Edward Denby, I now laugh. But F.D. Prince's name stayed in my head, and a few years later I was at university, and there in the window of Blackwell's was this little fulcrum book with a picture of this young man. And I bought that book, and that was the first book of Prince's that I really got to know and fell in love with. Partly because at that age, at 18, I felt this was an echo of much of my own sort of feelings at that time. This was 1969, 70, something like that. And there was this young man from a Christian Brothers school, as I had been, sort of odd family backgrounds, odd tensions and emotions, feeling ill at ease in this kind of world. So that was that book, and again that was a very sort of physically special book, that kind of fulcrum book. We saw it in the conference today. And from that I went to this book, Doors of Stone, which I found in the local library in Bristol. And the physicality, I think, of Doors of Stone is a remarkable thing, with this very sort of special paper, with this kind of little bits of hair stuck in the paper, or whatever it is. It's probably something very technical. But that again is kind of part of it. And there have been other lovely editions since. There was the Anvil collected poems was particularly special in that. I had that, and I did write something on that for Eddie Linden's magazine Aquarius, which then never got published, but it was the first time I had a chance to write on Prince. Anyway, the book. Now wars and waters, stars and wires, the dead hand in the iron glove, the bolted winds that ride death's cars, guns, gallows, barracks, poles and bars, seem to have laboured but to fetch us love. Planets that burn and freeze now wring their hands, or forced to please must twine them in a dance instead. Distraught cosmogonies, like bad old baffled fairies, stand where we, your head upon my hand, or sleeping hand in hand, or head by head, have closed the book of day and gone to bed. But body now be deep. Worn horn book, mirror of the sinful soul, or abbey of the Holy Ghost, the keep of spiritual valour, keep your foxed and wormed and rusty pages whole, that we may read our way. Like an old lantern by whose ray we hope to find a better light, glow feebly as you may, be torn and tattered, interleaved. One chapter will not be achieved until we read by touch as well as sight, and learn to turn the pages, kiss and write. You are periphery. And we would be the centre if we could, but break your circle, or could be without you, inconceivably ourselves, our multitude and solitude. You would be nothing then, as now all other things and men are turned to nothing at a touch of hand or lip. Again, we'd seek the soul. And having passed through you and through ourselves, at last find the dark kingdom that denies that such as selves and thoughts and bodies matter much. O enchiridion, O salutaris hostia in this kind, until that darkness comes, be all in one, be shadow to our double sun, but single as the purpose of our mind. For if by love we mean to seek and find a go-between spelt from your incunabula, and see at length what can be seen by some new light beyond decay, through you we must burn time away, and wither with the force of our idea the world of visible phenomena. Later on, just sort of, that was thinking down about the 70s, and of course that one was, I think, from the 40s. It certainly feels as though it's fused with the atmosphere of the Second World War, as much as soldiers bathing. Around the end of the last century, I was kind of headhunted by a guy called Jim McHugh to write stock obituaries of poets who were then turning about 70 for the Times. And this was a kind of rather strange job to have, which I didn't keep very long, or didn't do for a while. And then just, I've done 2 or 3 for him, only one of which has been published. The others would be unpublishable now. One of them has written 4 times as many books since that he'd written then. And he asked me to meet him for lunch, and what was the first week, I think, of the new century. And he said, who should we do that I've not asked you to do? And I said, F.T. Prince. And because he was interested in Eliot and bibliography, he sort of knew the first book and thought, and said, well, a short one. So I wrote 2 or 3 times as much as he asked me to do, and he sort of said, oh, well, perhaps he's more interesting than we thought. And they did eventually use it. But after I finished doing that sort of work, really, this poem got written, which is called The Next Poem. The new shells are in place, so what goes back on them becomes the debate. Do Jack Straw's Castle and The Doors of Stone stay on the living writer's shelf or move somewhere higher? All of which is a displacement of, or preamble to, the more unsettling question: what will fit in the slim gaps they leave? You tell me how your friend drew you a diagram of our latest and brightest best, using different coloured pens to show the links. Who published, prized, or who shagged who? A pretty spirograph flower. At its heart, another emptiness. Are we waiting for something more ethereal to cartwheel its way out of Zena with a faint whiff of whale meat and whiskey? Or a cool intelligence from east of Cape Cod to murmur our nerves to order? Not knowing where the next poem is coming from may be a virtue of sorts. We can sit out here on the pier wearing caps that sailors use to shade their eyes against the evening glare and look for shapes emerging from the deep. Or listen out as some lost air from the hinterland, faltering but true, prepares its passage through the lips. Thank you very much.
I was a student of F.T. Prince in the 60s, and I first got to know his poetry, other than Soldier's Bathing, of course, when Doors of Stone came out, and I bravely wrote a review of it. He wrote me a wonderfully generous letter, picking out the good things and saying how nice it was, and I'm sure keeping quiet about the mistakes. And I sort of put my review around the idea that most of the poems had the central theme of love of different forms. I don't know now whether that's true, but it seemed, as they say, a good idea at the time. And perhaps I was thinking of the Strambotti, which are love poems. So I'll just read those first and then read a related poem of mine. Coming to write my letter, overcast by all the days of absence that have gone, I think of others passing as they passed, so many days of sun that never shone, letters and days. And this is not the last, and I must doubt to see them stretching on, and wonder then why, if it would be strange, sooner or later, for our love to change. And yet I know our love has won the toss so many times, and most of all that day when your first letter came and chanced to cross one I had ventured, half afraid to say what I felt suddenly in dread of loss. And then your letter came, and in a way said less, but it could only be a sign. And so it all comes back to breathe and shine. And so I run it through. How love began, the light encounter while we hardly thought, the pleasant company without a plan. And then the wild desire, and we were caught, how then we were afraid, and light and ban had clawed at us like devils, but we fought, and in the end, won sweetness from it all. And how that would be sweeter to recall. And surely we will call it up again one day, and laugh to see it shine and sing. No, it is not a dream, but true and plain, and we shall never find a better thing. Then we shall bless what we have bought with pain, and close it like the two halves of a ring. Therefore my letter promises to go, and say, I wish that I could travel so. Wonderful poem. Interesting parallels I notice with Shakespeare's Sonnet 44, where he thinks if he were thought he could travel, but alas, he is not thought. I wrote something, still writing something, in Stramboti form, but the Stramboti are really used as stanzas rather than in the sort of sequence way in which Prince uses them there. Prince wasn't I'll just say a little bit so that to make it clear, because some things are not immediately obvious. I won't talk too much. Prince isn't the only poet who've written about Shaka, the Zulu leader. There's a South African poet called Mazizi Kunene, who wrote a long epic. And what interested me when I read about that was the way in which when Shaka is getting old, the second half of life, he's finished all his fighting, and he has these very vivid dreams in which old comrades from the war and his dead mother come and visit him. And the dreams are represented as if they're real. It's almost as if the person pulls up a chair and sits by your bed and you have a chat and catch up on everything. It's part of the belief in Kunene's culture that people aren't really dead until everybody who knew them, until everybody's forgotten them. They're still alive as memory. They're sort of sending the death as a gradual thing. And I try to represent a scene like that in my poem. The person called Guy is a man called Guy Robinson, who was a lecturer in the philosophy department at the time. And the reference, worst of all, is loss of love, of course, is from Prince's poem, Coeur de Lion. Oh, yes. Right, I'll start. Me as an insufferable student. What do I have to do to get a first? God, I still hear my voice and see your forehead sink until it's resting on the desk. It stayed there quite a while. And then you said, watching the window now, I think the best thing's to forget all that and just to read the books, to think about them, then in time perhaps what comes up might surprise. Like rhyme? Or so in hindsight now, I half construe what maybe you half meant, as if, old ghost, among my shelves, I can put that into your mouth. Rhyme happy in not being forced. Old guest, old honoured guest, sitting here now so late and patiently to grant me this, what is it, interview or audience, that I've no claim at all to, but pretense, pretender as I am indeed, and you, soldier, scholar, father, poet, prof, your spirit wearing yet the same tired, slow half smile as when I'd come in with some puffed up bit of pound shout, you thinking, I know, so petty bourgeois, yet able enough, you wrote, You may learn anything. You may learn anything you will, but aren't particularly teachable. And can repeat your every word, dear shadow. Please forgive the epithet, but what's the difference now when I can summon you like this, as if our roles have been reversed? And in that undergraduate review I did, Crit of the Prof, Guy smiled. And worst of all is loss of love, I said, went through it all. The exile theme of it, and you, that awkwardness. I wish I'd not been so long-sweatered, as it were, and you'd been less the gentleman, the gentle Don, with no too transient, no too strongly, and yet once, a line in one of Wyatt's Strambotti, you shaking your head and smiling at the text, I don't agree though with your scansion here, and grinning up straight at me, just as near. Thank you.
Lost track. Is it mine or somebody else?
No, it's you.
I want to read of Frank Prince. He did a small group of short poems, all set beside the sea, very possibly set on the coast here. There's a poem called Sea View. Sunlight catches a wall. It glows, and I recall 10 years ago our walk, and how we sat to stare, quite happy not to talk, blown by the mild sea air, benched in wind and sun above the pearl grey sea, perched on a broken cliff. The joy, the strange fragility, curious, conscious, pleased, the youth in everything, sweetened and yet not appeased by all our love could bring. And then the sunny quay, the ferry churning clear, gulls idling on the sea, and there along the pier the little trundling train. No doubt it trundles on, as I do, but again, grown sad that you are gone. And this is a short sea poem from about 45 years ago after I'd been rightly chided for pattering on. And I took those poems as like a lesson. It's called A Cliff Walk. In the distance, the cliff walk, decorated piers, now antique. You lie away. The ocean is so vast. Someday, I'm waiting. Is your patience enough? Ghosts haunt the sights of our past. Someday soon, across the ocean, coming, such love goes far beyond. Green seas look soft and turn grey, the white chalk, the cap of dark woods. It is a matter of wonder. What comes with time? Such hands, silhouetted in the window, with the seacoast stretching off into the distance. Then maybe it falters. The window, in a white glow, such a blue sky in all this. walk turning from side to side, and soft winds brushing, ghosts, distance of the sea town. You filter the pines. There you green paint wet on the leaves. The clothes we loved.
Just a brief plug. There's a couple of essays coming out on maverick poetry and something I'm calling afterism, which are coming out from an online magazine called The Fortnightly Review, and Prince is very much the feature of the Mavericks essay. So do have a look for that. And also, Grey Suit still exists in terms of something called Grey Suit Poem Stream, which comes out on Facebook and has got soldiers bathing up on it. And Ashbury has sent us something, and I welcome anything from any of the poets who have read today. It would be lovely to have their work on the stream. It's edited by myself and Pamela Stewart in America and Kerry Lee Powell in Canada. And I was out and we all got together, actually physically. I mean, not physically, but not online, and met together and talked and planned what we would do next at Jodie's lovely farm overlooking the hills of Vermont. And she has 9 dogs. I mention that before I read Frank's wonderful poem, from Frank's wonderful poem, His Dog and Pilgrim. I think you all know the story of St. Roch, who having cured lots of plague victims, contracted the plague himself, and was looked after by a dog who, in Frank's note, brought him food. And this sort of image of fidelity, I suppose. But I think about that line about kissing the wounds. So this is the part of the second section. A wise dog, a nice dog, is twice dog. Amicus, amorous, the good, brave, generous and clever dog, bright boy. But oh, you vagabond, you poor old slavey chap, poor crackpot, addled, classical lost heart, not fast and loose, but deep and douce, but humbly liquefied, drop-eared and sorry-eyed by foot or lap or knee, not knowing it will never do. He asking fondly for some kind or kin or kindled godliness, some goodly fondleness, unbearably, not knowing that it will not do, be never, not be true. How so we go in grace, silk air and sun of summer, taking and betaken for a walk, my ride, my hop, my read and write, and rumbles, tumbles, turns here to be shrewd, panting importantly, sitting down hastily to itch, then on to such collating, snufflicating, dating what all they, every one gone, said and done. Says he, said that, she did, indeed, and was it? And who would so drivel? But if so, I'll quote and add my note. Adds nothing but to sign the same, turn round and scratch the ground stiffly with hinder claws, mutter and bristle hence, that too misguided ghost, fool dog and his impertinence, his mere faded consequence? Well, I have poems which are very, very much influenced by Frank, but my difficulty is I sort of feel that I ought to read another dog poem, which is more about content really than style. Though I suppose I've always been very, very caught between the wonderful poets of the New York School and what I used to think of as abstract poetry, and some sort of imperative towards some sort of content. And so I think I was thinking two ways. I was thinking about one of Jodie's dogs, a dog called Bravo, which was sort of Piemontese dog, about this high, but guardian dog, one of 9, he keeps guardian dogs, all a bit old. And I was also thinking about how verbs always seem to go to specific and particular nouns, or nouns take specific verbs. And so there was a certain sort of, that same sort of tension between content and language, which I think is really what is going on in Frank. Anyhow, it's called Bravo. The dog croaks. The house snuffles. The man pounces. The house floats. The man squawks. The dog babbles. The man flaps. The dog flutters. The house scolds. The dog sways. The man chirrups. The house buzzes. The man floats. The dog croons. The house veers. The house cheeps. The man quacks. The dog hovers. The dog soars. The house molts. The man hangs. The man hops. The dog scampers. The house drools. The lake ripples. The dog laps. The man drifts. The dog reflects. The lake twinkles. The man sows. The lake bleaches. The man frays. The dog gleams. The lake glitters. The dog sinks. The man fills. The man breathes. The dog sits. The man drinks. The dog watches. The man scratches. The dog steals. Thank you very much.
I'd like to read from the end of the second part of Walks in Rome, and then just into the beginning of the third part. But before I do, I feel compelled, or I'd like to just tune into one or two things that people have said during the reading. Like Tim, I also attempted to review the 1979 collected poems from Anvil for the Cambridge Quarterly, and I did indeed write the review and typed it all up in the old days on the typewriter and handed my one copy in to the reviews editor. And after a while I went to see him to ask what had happened, and not only had he not printed it, but he'd lost it. And I think something may click with you if I tell you his name was Oliver Letwin. Finally, I did manage to get to review Prince's poetry. I reviewed the 1993 collected poems in PM Review and gave it the title, borrowed from one of the poems, of course. Was it something that I've forgotten the word? Is it rendered up to fiction, or offered up to fiction? Sorry, I've forgotten the phrase. But anyway, it's the fiction is the word I'm going to come back to in a moment. Again, as with John Haynes's memorial moment, he wrote to me a very, very generous letter when I was living out in Japan, thanking me for the review. And as a result of it, I came to Southampton and met him. We engaged in a short correspondence, which really ended, I think, because he was old and was feeling that this sort of literary correspondence with the young had its day for him. Nevertheless, I was intensely grateful for it. And perhaps I could just pass on to you the real the piece of wisdom that I carry around with me from that correspondence or that meeting with him. I can't remember quite which. I must have mentioned something about that famous little poem of Yeats's about perfection of the life or the art. And he said, don't worry about that, you mess up both of them. Here we are. On that note, I will read the... Naaman of Bratislav says, true faith has no need to grapple with evidence or research. Faith comes through silence. I see that too and enter the French church. We come here now for the chapel by Caravaggio. Christ on the left wall points a finger to call Matthew the money changer, sitting well dressed, in no danger. On the right there is rage, blood, death. In his old age a naked killer bawling has cut him down. A boy wails and an angel dives with the martyr's crown. Another angel behind the altar, between calling and death, indicts the gospel, and he writes, looking up as in doubt of his own mind. At both beginning and end, grouped as bystanders, gaudily dressed, idle young cronies, well-fed parasites, and older panders lazily attend. Christ's face is mysterious, oblique in the strong lights and shadows. The dense, wild canvases bully and in the end weary us with ambiguities. So, feeling himself like us, back of the murder scene, Michelangelo Merisi da Caravaggio, turning, about to go, looks pale and queasy. By this time I have been too long on my feet, seen too much and am tiring. I must sit down and eat when I look back from Matthew to the plaque. The painter's face, if it is that, from yesterday, came back on this stiff, bare climb to the Capitol. I have done without the Holy Child or white and golden doll, but nothing through the two museums, but gone through the two museums rather slowly, and am now gazing through glass at a cold sunlit garden with frozen bird bath and a box-edged path. But I am still or again trying to place, Caravaggio or not, that pale, scornful face, and find it far away back, at just the end of the war. He was one of a mixed sort lot, Sicilian, a prisoner of 40 years ago, when for 6 months or so I was their interpreter. They were working on the land, but waiting after defeat and capture, captivity, and the dour years of exile to be sent home to meet what might be waiting for them in a wrecked Italy. And meanwhile there was some bile, some bitterness, if more patience found. Like me, they were more or less tired, and looking round and feeling older. One was hollow, not fulfilled, but bewildered most, to find the post-war, post-strength and decision, but not post the sense of waste, not post self-division. I left it very, very late, really, to go to America for the first time. And in November 2006 I was there, and for some reason or other I just decided to have another read of Walks in Rome. And as Todd very kindly remembered, I do think that Frank Prince's wonderful attention to technique and to different verse forms, and we've heard such different kinds of poetry this evening, it gives us a permission to do all sorts of things that we might not otherwise do. And this is not really, again, not like him at all, I don't think, but it's written in little 5-line verses, which I do think I just picked up, as it were, when I was writing. I just picked up a bit of the sound of the verse form of Walks in Rome. That's the only connection. So I thought, but then there's a reference to a movie that was out in Los Angeles as I was there called Stranger Than Fiction. So I wonder if the title to the review that I can't remember, with the word fiction in it, was actually sort of ticking away in the background. Anyway, it's called Westwood Dusk. At the corner of Wiltshire and Westwood, What looked like a corpse has collapsed on the sidewalk, a smear of saliva expressed from his lips. Somebody glanced back, sun setting on the sea, beyond wild, thin frontage, boulevards, palm trees, and a stoplight's countdown. I stepped off and ran for my life. That corpse was out cold but breathing, and nobody in the least phased that hymned on West or Westwood. With sirens still sounding, a paramedic fire truck drew up at the bus stop, those people left standing around as he lay. Fixed under a sky glow, stranger than fiction, had opened at the Westwood crest. I was checking my direction with best foot forward, seeing and believing it there in LA. And I thought we really shouldn't end this evening, this day devoted to F.T. Prince with some of my words. So I hope you will forgive me for going beyond the brief very, very slightly, just to read the last few lines of Keats' Country, a poem that Prince himself published towards the end of his life, which has yet to be collected. This is about the M3 motorway cutting through Twyford Down, among other things, and so I'll just read the last sentence or two from it. And one can see from here what the experts in blame will make this year of Keats and of his England in its pride and brigand glory, self-righteousness its guide, winning and losing empires. And are defeats and victories so cancelled in my Keats country, where meaning beyond either covers both, living in the song, the verse that lovers and women hear as truth, sometimes believe it and never quite forget? But there I leave it.
Thank you very much, Georgie, for coming and making this such a wonderful day. Thank you for all the papers, readings, questions, conversations, and just your presence. Some of us are going over to Tino's, is that right? Yeah. For dinner. If you want to join us, have a word with Will. Otherwise, have a good journey home. And again, thank you, and let's all go on reading Prince and... Not Prince. It's been a long day.